The invisible shift. When love quietly turns into control. It didn't start with cruelty. It didn't start with shouting, insults, or slammed doors. It started with warmth, with laughter that felt healing, with conversations that went on until 2 a.m., where she looked into your eyes and said, "I've never felt this safe with anyone before." And you believed her, because you felt it too. Daniel remembers that version of love vividly, the kind that feels destined, the kind that convinces you the universe finally got it right. Laura listened with an intensity that felt rare. She mirrored his values, his dreams, even his wounds. Around her, he felt chosen, seen, essential. Then, something shifted. Not suddenly. The warmth didn't disappear, it thinned. Her affection didn't vanish, it became unpredictable. The closeness that once felt natural now had conditions he couldn't quite name. Daniel found himself replaying conversations, analyzing texts, scanning her face for emotional weather reports. He was still in the relationship, but no longer on solid ground. That's what makes the female covert narcissist so hard to recognize. There is no obvious monster, no loud ego, no open cruelty. She appears sensitive, introspective, emotionally complex, often wounded. And that's why the confusion cuts so deeply, because you don't feel abused. You feel like you're failing someone fragile. This is where the idealization quietly gives way to devaluation. Not through attacks, but through absence, through subtle disappointment, through the sense that the love you once had is now something you must earn back. Intermittent moments of warmth keep hope alive, while long stretches of emotional cold train your nervous system to work harder, give more, and ask for less. Nothing exploded, yet everything eroded. Daniel didn't lose himself overnight. He lost clarity first, confidence second, identity last. And all the while, he told himself the same thing most people tell themselves in this situation. If I just do better, this will go back to how it was. This story isn't about weakness. It's about conditioning. And if any of this feels uncomfortably familiar, stay with me, because naming the pattern is how the spell begins to break. If this kind of content resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and support the work. It helps us keep creating honest, grounded conversations that bring clarity to confusing relationships. Quick question for you. Which feels closer to your experience? A. The relationship changed slowly, without a clear breaking point. B. You felt from early on that something was off, but couldn't explain it. Comment A or B below. I'm reading every response. Weaponized, vulnerability, and emotional baiting. Laura didn't pull Daniel in with charm alone. What bonded him to her was vulnerability. Early on, she shared stories that felt intimate and heavy abandonment, betrayal. Moments when she said she had been too much for others to handle. She spoke as if letting him into a locked room. "I don't usually open up like this," she told him. "Please be gentle with my heart." Daniel listened, steady and present, feeling honored to be trusted. Without realizing it, he stepped into a role that would later define the relationship. Protector, regulator, emotional anchor. At first, that closeness felt reciprocal. But slowly, vulnerability changed shape. The same stories that once created intimacy became leverage. If Laura felt anxious or distant, it was reframed as something Daniel had caused. He hadn't reassured her enough. He hadn't anticipated her needs. He hadn't proven that he was safe. The pain she carried was no longer her history, it was his responsibility. This is weaponized vulnerability. What looks like softness becomes a tool that binds you through guilt. Daniel began managing not just his actions, but his emotional output. He learned which words soothed and which ones triggered withdrawal. He learned to apologize quickly even when he didn't understand the charge, because confusion was better than losing access to her warmth. Over time, he stopped asking himself whether the accusations were fair and focused only on making them stop. Alongside this came emotional baiting. Laura would insist something was wrong without saying what it was. She accused Daniel of having a tone, of being distant, of bringing negative energy into the room. When he denied it, she pushed harder. When he finally reacted defensive, frustrated, confused, that reaction became the evidence. "See?" she'd say. "This is why I don't feel safe." The conflicts felt spontaneous but followed a pattern. They often surfaced before meaningful moments like the night before a trip to Chicago, or just as things felt calm again. Resolution was never the goal. The goal was dysregulation. Emotional baiting keeps you off balance, constantly adjusting yourself to avoid the next rupture. Daniel didn't realize when it happened, but his attention turned inward. He monitored his expressions, his silences, even his thoughts. He wasn't responding to reality anymore, he was responding to her emotional weather. And that is how control takes root. Not through force, but through the quiet training of your nervous system to prioritize someone else's inner world over your own. Invalidation and emotional recklessness. At some point, Daniel realized that speaking honestly no longer led to understanding, it led to shutdown. Whenever he tried to express discomfort or confusion, Laura's response followed a familiar arc. She dismissed his feelings as exaggerated, reframed his concerns as attacks, or suggested that his reactions were rooted in his own flaws. "You're too sensitive," she'd say. "You always take things the wrong way." What began as subtle deflection hardened into a rule. His inner world was not welcome. This is invalidation at work, not disagreement, but erasure. Daniel wasn't told he was wrong. He was told he was unreliable. The message landed quietly and repeatedly. Your perception cannot be trusted. Over time, he learned to preempt the dismissal by minimizing himself first. He softened his language, added disclaimers, apologized before finishing a sentence. Eventually, he stopped bringing things up at all. Silence felt safer than being reduced. When Laura did offer an apology, it arrived thin and conditional. "I'm sorry you felt that way," she'd say. Or, "I wouldn't have reacted like that if you hadn't pushed me." The apology didn't restore balance. It redirected blame. Daniel left these conversations more confused than before, carrying a sense of responsibility he couldn't quite justify, but couldn't shake either. Alongside invalidation came emotional recklessness. Laura handled Daniel's vulnerability carelessly, as if it carried no weight. When he cried or admitted fear, she seemed unmoved, sometimes bored, sometimes irritated. The tenderness he once believed they shared was absent. Worse, the personal history he had trusted her with resurfaced later during arguments, repurposed as proof of his inadequacy. His pain was not held. It was catalogued. This absence of empathy isn't a normal relational rupture. It's a fundamental imbalance. Daniel's nervous system adapted the only way it could, by numbing. He learned not to expect comfort. He learned not to reach. He became hyperfunctional on the outside and increasingly hollow within. The cost of staying emotionally present was too high. What hurt most wasn't the conflict itself, but the loneliness inside the relationship. Daniel felt unseen, while standing inches away from someone who once promised safety. He began to grieve quietly, not just the relationship he thought he had, but the version of himself who used to believe his feelings mattered. Invalidation and emotional recklessness don't leave bruises, but they leave imprints. They teach you to doubt your own experience and to survive by shrinking. And when that lesson takes hold, the most dangerous loss isn't the relationship, it's your connection to yourself. No-win scenarios and comparison games. No-win scenarios and comparison games. By the time Daniel noticed it, every disagreement had become a trap. If he tried to step away to cool down, Laura accused him of abandonment. If he stayed and tried to talk things through, she said he was pressuring her, overwhelming her, or trying to control the conversation. Silence was wrong. Engagement was wrong. Every option led to the same destination: blame. This is the architecture of a no-win scenario. It isn't chaos. It's a closed system. Daniel slowly learned that resolution was impossible because resolution was never the point. The rules changed depending on what he chose, ensuring that he was always in the wrong. Over time, he stopped trusting his instincts. He didn't ask, "What's the healthy response?" anymore. He asked, "Which mistake will cost me less?" That mental shift is devastating. It creates learned helplessness, a state where effort feels pointless and agency erodes. Daniel found himself freezing during conflict, not because he didn't care, but because caring had become dangerous. Any move could be used against him later. Alongside this, comparison seeped into the relationship like a slow toxin. Laura rarely criticized him outright. Instead, she referenced others' men who were more decisive, more attentive, more successful, more emotionally intuitive. Sometimes it was an ex. Sometimes it was a coworker's partner. Sometimes it was an unnamed someone who just seemed to know how to do things better. The comparisons were subtle, almost casual, but they landed with precision. At a dinner with friends in New York City, Daniel felt it in real time. A passing comment about how some men really know how to show up hung in the air just long enough to make him feel small without giving him anything concrete to respond to. If he pushed back, he was defensive. If he stayed quiet, he was insecure. These games hijack something deep. They tap into competitiveness, identity, and the desire to be chosen. Daniel worked harder, gave more, tried to anticipate needs that were never clearly stated. The harder he tried, the further away the finish line moved. Eventually, a painful truth surfaced. He wasn't competing with other men. He was competing with an ever-shifting standard that no one could meet. The comparisons weren't about improvement, they were about destabilization. In no-win scenarios and comparison games, the damage isn't just emotional exhaustion. It's the slow dismantling of self-trust. Daniel didn't feel like he was failing a relationship anymore. He felt like he was failing at being a person, and that is exactly where control becomes complete. Performance scoring and one-way boundaries. Love didn't disappear for Daniel, it became transactional. Somewhere along the way, affection turned into a scorecard. Laura began to measure moments instead of sharing them. A weekend together was fine, but not what I expected. A thoughtful gesture earned brief approval, quickly followed by disappointment. Even intimacy felt evaluated, as if Daniel were constantly being assessed against criteria he never agreed to and could never fully see. This is performance scoring. It reframes connection as output. Effort becomes currency, and worth is always conditional. Daniel found himself tracking his own behavior the way an employee tracks metrics: how much he gave, how well he performed, how he could do better next time. The approval, when it came, was fleeting. It never settled into safety. It only raised the stakes for the next round. The danger of this system is not the criticism itself, but the internal shift it creates. Daniel stopped asking what he wanted. He focused on optimizing. He planned conversations, rehearsed emotional responses, and pushed himself past exhaustion because stopping felt like failure. When Laura was satisfied, even briefly, it felt like relief, not joy. And relief is a poor substitute for love. Boundaries revealed the imbalance more clearly than anything else. Laura's limits were immovable. Her need for space, privacy, or special consideration was unquestionable. Daniel respected them instinctively, afraid that crossing a line would trigger withdrawal or disappointment. But when he tried to assert his own boundaries, asking for rest, consistency, or basic respect, those needs were reframed as selfish, needy, or unreasonable. This is the cruelty of one-way boundaries. They are not about protection. They are about power. Daniel learned that his discomfort mattered only when it aligned with Laura's preferences. If it didn't, it was dismissed or punished. He asked himself whether wanting fairness made him demanding, whether wanting reciprocity made him weak. That self-questioning is the point. When boundaries feel dangerous to express, control is already in place. Daniel wasn't failing to set boundaries. He was being trained not to have them. Performance scoring keeps you striving. One-way boundaries keep you small. Together, they create a dynamic where you are constantly proving your value to someone who never has to prove theirs. And the most painful realization Daniel faced wasn't that he couldn't win. It was that the game was never about love at all. Surveillance, identity, erosion, and the path back to yourself. By the end, control no longer announced itself as conflict. It arrived, disguised as concern. Laura wanted to know where Daniel was, who he was with, why he made certain choices, and whether he had considered better options. The questions were framed gently, even reasonably. I just worry about you. I'm trying to understand. I want us to be aligned. But over time, those questions accumulated weight. Daniel felt observed, evaluated, corrected. This is surveillance in its quietest form. Not domination through force, but through constant scrutiny. Daniel began explaining himself preemptively, justifying decisions before they were questioned. He checked in more than he wanted to. He delayed choices until he could predict her reaction. Slowly, autonomy dissolved. He wasn't being guided. He was being managed. The deeper cost revealed itself in subtler ways. Daniel stopped trusting his instincts. Simple decisions felt heavy. He second-guessed his preferences, his reactions, even his memories. Laura's version of events became the default reference point, and his inner voice grew faint. This is identity erosion. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens when your sense of self is consistently overridden by someone else's narrative. Daniel didn't wake up one day feeling broken. He woke up feeling empty. The parts of him that once felt spontaneous, confident, and grounded had gone quiet. He was still functioning, still showing up, but he no longer recognized the person doing it. What finally shifted wasn't a dramatic ending. It was a moment of clarity. Daniel noticed that the relationship required him to disappear in order to survive. That realization didn't come with rage. It came with grief. Grief for the self he had abandoned, trying to keep someone else emotionally stable. The path back begins there. Not with blame, but with truth. Healing is not about fixing what was wrong with you. It's about reconnecting to what was always right. It starts with small acts of self-trust. Making a decision without explaining it. Honoring a feeling without defending it. Choosing rest without guilt. It involves regulating a nervous system that has been trained to stay on alert, and gently reminding yourself that love does not require constant self-surveillance. Daniel's story doesn't end with revenge or triumph. It ends with reclamation. Awareness is not cruelty. Distance is not punishment. Boundaries are not abandonment. They are how you come home to yourself. And if you recognize yourself anywhere in this journey, know this: you were never weak. You were conditioned. And what was conditioned can be undone. Conclusion. What Daniel's story teaches us, and how it applies to your life. Daniel's story is not about a villain and a victim in the traditional sense. It is about a slow psychological drift, one that happens quietly, subtly, and often, without conscious awareness. What began as connection turned into confusion. What felt like love became obligation. What looked like intimacy slowly transformed into control. And the most devastating part was not the arguments, the coldness, or the emotional distance. It was how gradually Daniel lost his sense of self while still believing he was the problem. The deeper truth of this story is that psychological control rarely announces itself. It disguises itself as concern, sensitivity, depth, or love that simply needs more effort. Daniel didn't stay because he was weak. He stayed because he was human, because hope, empathy, and loyalty were used as leverage against him. By the time he recognized the pattern, his confidence had already been eroded, his instincts muted, and his identity bent around someone else's emotional gravity. The lesson here is not leave faster or spot narcissists better. The real lesson is this: any relationship that requires you to abandon your inner reality in order to survive is not love. It is conditioning. Healthy relationships may be challenging, but they do not require self-erasure. They do not punish boundaries. They do not make you doubt your own perception of reality. So how do you apply this to your life today? Start by listening to what your nervous system has been trying to tell you. Chronic anxiety, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, or constant self-doubt are not personality flaws, they are signals. Practice small acts of self-trust, saying no without explaining, honoring discomfort without justifying it, noticing patterns instead of isolated incidents. Learn to value consistency over intensity and safety over chemistry. Most importantly, remember this: awareness is not bitterness. Distance is not cruelty. Boundaries are not abandonment. They are acts of self-respect. Disclaimer: this video is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional diagnosis, psychological evaluation, or therapy from a licensed mental health professional. Quick question for you. Which feels more true right now? A. I'm starting to recognize patterns I ignored before. B. I've already begun rebuilding my sense of self. Comment A or B below. What's your perspective on Daniel's story? What resonated with you, or what would you add from your own experience? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your insight. And if this content helps you feel clearer, less alone, or more grounded, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful, honest conversations that truly matter.